May 26, 1941. About 9:10 at night, 300 miles west of Brest, France. Rain hit hard on the cloth wings of the old biplane. While the pilot kept flying through the storm, the Fairey Swordfish shook and jumped in the strong wind. Every big gust almost flipped it over. The pilot held the control stick tight with both hands, trying to stay level and on course. Through the open cockpit, he could barely see ahead. Only a few yards, not miles. The rain blew sideways like sharp needles hitting his face. The wind pulled at them, and ice formed fast on their goggles, faster than they could wipe it away. Their leather flying suits that were supposed to be waterproof had been soaked for hours. Water ran down their backs and pooled under them. Their hands were numb even inside thick gloves. Behind each pilot sat an observer and a radio gunner, both freezing so badly the water inside their bottles had turned to ice. They had been flying almost 2 hours, 2 hours of fighting the storm, 2 hours of wondering if they would ever find their target, 2 hours of knowing that even if they did, they might not make it back. Their altimeter showed 800 feet, and over these wild seas, that meant just above the tops of the waves. Huge walls of water rose 30, sometimes 40 feet high in the dark. It was almost impossible to tell how high they really were. Some swordfish planes had already crashed into the sea while trying to fly this low. Under them, somewhere in the black, stormy ocean, moved the most powerful warship in the world, the German battleship Bismarck. It carried 8 15-inch guns that could fire shells weighing a ton, more than 20 miles. It was 50,000 tons of steel, power, and armor, strong enough to bounce off shells from the best British ships. It had 14 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns and many smaller guns, all waiting to stop what the British were trying to do. And their only weapon was a torpedo hanging under a small cloth-covered biplane that looked like it belonged in a museum, not in a war. A Fairey Swordfish that could only fly about 143 miles an hour on a good day, with an open cockpit, fixed landing gear, and a body made of metal tubes covered with fabric that bullets could punch right through. The Germans had laughed when they first heard about it through spy reports. They thought this old plane from World War I could never hurt their proud Navy. But in just 2 hours, this outdated biplane and 14 others like it would do what the whole British home fleet could not. They would hit the Bismarck and end her fight forever. The story of how a plane everyone called useless became the one that changed sea battles for good did not start in the wild Atlantic storm. It began 7 years earlier in the quiet offices of the Fairey Aviation Company in West London in 1934. People there were drawing plans for a plane that already looked old even before it was built. Fairey Aviation had been making planes for the Navy since 1915. Its founder, Charles Richard Fairey, started the company during World War I, and they knew exactly what the Fleet Air Arm needed, better than anyone else. They needed planes that could find targets for the big Navy guns, carry torpedoes to sink enemy ships, take off and land safely on moving ships in bad weather, stay strong in sea air, and be easy to fix by crews with little equipment. The new plane was called the TSR-2, which meant Torpedo Spotter Reconnaissance. It was planned as a biplane with 2 wings, one over the other, held together with wires and bars. It would use one Bristol Pegasus engine that made about 690 horsepower. It had an open cockpit, so the crew would face the weather head-on. Winter flights over the cold North Atlantic could drop to 20 below zero, while summer missions in the hot Mediterranean could feel like an oven. They would face both kinds of weather. It had fixed landing wheels that slowed it down but made carrier takeoffs and landings much easier. There were no tricky hydraulic systems to brake or jam. The wheels were always down, always ready to land. The whole frame was made from steel tubes covered in tight fabric, coated and painted, just like planes from World War I. New fighters by then were made of shiny metal with smooth skin, one wing, and wheels that pulled up inside the body and cockpits closed tight against the air. The comparison looked bad. Many people in the Air Ministry asked why Britain was still making such an old kind of plane. Some even said to cancel it and wait for newer, modern ones. Around the world, fast single-wing planes were now normal, but the Fairey designers picked to biplane on purpose. It was not because they were behind or stubborn. It was smart planning. Flying from ships needed different things than flying from land. The design had to fit the limits of aircraft carriers in the 1930s. Those ships had short decks. The HMS Ark Royal, finished in 1938, had a deck only 720 feet long. Today's jet carriers have decks over 1,000 feet long. The Swordfish had to take off and land in less than half that space, on a deck that was moving up and down in rough seas. That meant it needed to fly slow and lift fast. The two big wings of the biplane gave it just that. The Swordfish could land at about 67 miles per hour. Modern carrier planes land at more than 120. That difference let the Swordfish fly and land even in stormy seas, when faster planes had to stay grounded. Its open cockpit, though cold and wet, gave the observer a clear view all around, which was very useful for finding enemy ships. They often had to search huge areas of ocean for hours. If the cockpit was closed, the glass and frames would block the view and cause reflections. So while it was rough on the crew, it worked better for the job. The fixed landing gear also made life easier on the ship, because every part and tool had to be carried on board. Wheels that pulled up into the plane needed pumps and pipes and could break or jam. The wheels were always down, always ready to land. The whole frame was made from steel tubes covered in tight fabric, coated and painted, just like planes from World War I. New fighters by then were made of shiny metal with smooth skin, one wing, and wheels that pulled up inside the body and cockpits closed tight against the air. The comparison looked bad. Many people in the Air Ministry asked why Britain was still making such an old kind of plane. Some even said to cancel it and wait for newer, modern ones. Around the world, fast single-wing planes were now normal, but the Fairey designers picked to biplane on purpose. It was not because they were behind or stubborn. It was smart planning. Flying from ships needed different things than flying from land. The design had to fit the limits of aircraft carriers in the 1930s. Those ships had short decks. The HMS Ark Royal, finished in 1938, had a deck only 720 feet long. Today's jet carriers have decks over 1,000 feet long. The Swordfish had to take off and land in less than half that space, on a deck that was moving up and down in rough seas. That meant it needed to fly slow and lift fast. The two big wings of the biplane gave it just that. The Swordfish could land at about 67 miles per hour. Modern carrier planes land at more than 120. That difference let the Swordfish fly and land even in stormy seas when faster planes had to stay grounded. Its open cockpit, though cold and wet, gave the observer a clear view all around, which was very useful for finding enemy ships. They often had to search huge areas of ocean for hours. If the cockpit was closed, the glass and frames would block the view and cause reflections. So while it was rough on the crew, it worked better for the job. The fixed landing gear also made life easier on the ship, because every part and tool had to be carried on board. Wheels that pulled up into the plane needed pumps and pipes and could break or jam. The wheels were always down, always ready to land. The whole frame was made from steel tubes covered in tight fabric, coated and painted, just like planes from World War I. New fighters by then were made of shiny metal with smooth skin, one wing, and wheels that pulled up inside the body and cockpits closed tight against the air. The comparison looked bad. Many people in the Air Ministry asked why Britain was still making such an old kind of plane. Some even said to cancel it and wait for newer, modern ones. Around the world, fast single-wing planes were now normal, but the Fairey designers picked to biplane on purpose. It was not because they were behind or stubborn. It was smart planning. Flying from ships needed different things than flying from land.
The design had to fit the limits of aircraft carriers in the 1930s. Those ships had short decks. The HMS Ark Royal, finished in 1938, had a deck only 720 feet long. Today's jet carriers have decks over 1,000 feet long. The Swordfish had to take off and land in less than half that space, on a deck that was moving up and down in rough seas. That meant it needed to fly slow and lift fast. The two big wings of the biplane gave it just that. The Swordfish could land at about 67 miles per hour. Modern carrier planes land at more than 120. That difference let the Swordfish fly and land even in stormy seas when faster planes had to stay grounded. Its open cockpit, though cold and wet, gave the observer a clear view all around, which was very useful for finding enemy ships. They often had to search huge
Attack ever. Each one carried either an 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo or a load of bombs and flares. The torpedoes were specially changed with wooden fins that broke away. This let them run through the shallow 30 to 40-foot waters of Taranto Harbor. Normal torpedoes would have just sunk into the mud. Nobody knew for sure if these new ones would even work. At 8:35 that evening, the first group of 12 Swordfish took off into the night, led by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson. His plane carried a torpedo. Behind him flew 5 more torpedo planes and 6 others loaded with bombs and flares. The flare planes would light up the harbor. The bombers would try to silence the gun batteries, and the torpedo planes would go in for the kill. Around 9:15, the second group of 9 Swordfish took off, led by Lieutenant Commander John Hale. 8 of the planes carried torpedoes. One of them had to turn back soon after takeoff when its extra fuel tank fell off, so only 20 planes really attacked Taranto that night, instead of 21. The flight took about an hour and a half. The crews flew at 8,000 feet, using only the stars and dead reckoning to find their way across the dark Mediterranean. Each observer bent over his small map table, working out wind drift and ground speed, while the pilots kept their planes steady and trusted their observers completely. Even one tiny mistake could send them far off course, and they would miss the harbor entirely. Radio silence was total. If the Italians heard them, the whole mission would fail. As they got close to Taranto, the men could actually see the harbor clearly even in the dark. The Italians had left lights on all around the base and the nearby city. They seemed more worried about spies than about bombers. They never believed the British would try a torpedo strike inside a protected harbor. They thought the water there was too shallow for torpedoes to work, but they were wrong. They had barrage balloons floating above the harbor to block low-flying planes, but only 27 were up instead of the planned 87 because strong winds that day had forced most down. That left wide-open gaps in their defenses and gave the Swordfish pilots a clear path they should not have had. Luck was clearly on Britain's side. The first wave reached Taranto at 11:07. The planes carrying flares flew high and dropped their bright magnesium flares on parachutes. They floated down slowly, lighting everything below with a sharp white glow. It was like daytime suddenly. Every ship and dock stood out clearly. The Italians were totally shocked. Air raid sirens started screaming. Searchlights swept the sky, and then the shooting began. The harbor exploded with anti-aircraft fire. The shore guns fired over 13,000 shells, and the ships fired thousands more. The whole sky filled with streaks of red, white, and green from tracer bullets. Heavy shells burst in dark clouds. The sound was thunderous. And none of the Italian gunners had ever faced a real attack before. They had practiced a lot before, but practice is never the same as real battle. Their shooting was wild and fast, but not very accurate. They were trying to hit slow, old biplanes that kept turning and weaving in every direction. The Swordfish pilots kept going right through the storm of gunfire. Williamson pointed his plane straight at the battleship Conte de Cavour, flying just 30 feet above the water. When he got within 200 yards, he dropped his torpedo. It ran perfectly and hit the ship below the waterline. The explosion tore a giant hole in the side, and the battleship sank part way to the bottom of the harbor.
Williamson's plane was hit by flak and crashed. He and his partner, Lieutenant Norman Scarlett, lived but were captured. Next, Lieutenant Neil Kemp went after the new battleship Littorio. His torpedo hit, then Lieutenant Charles Lamb followed with another hit. Soon the big ship was flooding badly. The second wave reached Taranto a little after midnight. More flares lit up the harbor, and the guns opened up again. Lieutenant Gerald Bailey dived on the cruiser Gorizia. His plane got hit and went down in flames. Bailey and his partner, Lieutenant Henry Slaughter, were killed. Even so, the rest of the torpedo planes kept attacking. Littorio was hit a third time. The battleship Caio Duilio took one torpedo and began leaning to the side. By 2:39 in the morning, the attack was finished. 20 Swordfish had struck the main base of the Italian battle fleet. Only 2 planes were lost. 2 men were killed and 2 were taken prisoner. 4 men lost out of 20 attacking planes against all the guns of a major naval base was amazing. Some people said it was just luck. The Italian defenses had not worked as planned. The missing barrage balloons had left holes in their protection, and the gunners were shooting at night at tricky moving targets. But luck was not the whole story. The Swordfish crews had trained hard for this kind of mission. They had practiced taking off and landing from carriers at night, over and over again. They had practiced torpedo runs again and again. They had studied pictures of Taranto to learn every gun position and approach path. When the time came, they flew their plan perfectly with courage and discipline. The results were terrible for Italy. 3 battleships were hit. Conte de Cavour took one torpedo that ripped her open. She sank to the harbor bottom with her deck barely showing above the water. She was later raised and moved to Trieste for repair, but the work was never finished. She never fought again. The Italian Navy had lost a battleship for good. Littorio was hit by 3 torpedoes and almost went under. Only hard work by her crew kept her floating. She was out of service for 7 months. Caio Duilio was hit by 1 torpedo that flooded 2 boiler rooms and made her lean badly. She too was gone for 7 months. In one night, half of Italy's battleship power was gone. They had started the war with 6 ships. Now, only 3 could fight. This one attack changed everything in the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy now had the upper hand. With the Italian fleet crippled, British convoys to Malta could move more safely, and supplies to Egypt were more secure. Admiral Andrew Cunningham could take chances he never could before. The Italian Navy became careful, afraid to lose what was left. They kept their ships in port instead of using them boldly. The effects went far beyond Europe. Japanese naval officers studied the Taranto raid closely in Europe. A Japanese attaché visited the site in early 1941 to see the damage and talk with Italian officers. What they learned shaped the plan for Pearl Harbor 11 months later. They saw that torpedoes could work in shallow water if built right. They saw that battleships in harbor were easy targets. They learned that a surprise carrier strike could destroy an enemy fleet before it could fight back. Taranto proved that planes could cripple big warships, and that aircraft carriers were now the most powerful weapon at sea. And it showed that the old-looking Swordfish could do amazing things when flown by skilled crews. But Taranto was only the start. 6 months later, the Swordfish would face an even bigger test. In May 1941, the German battleship Bismarck entered the Atlantic. It was the newest and strongest ship in the German Navy. Weighing over 50,000 tons, it had 8 big 15-inch guns, thick armor more than 12 inches deep, and could move at 31 knots. It was built to break into the Atlantic shipping lanes and destroy the convoys that fed Britain. The Royal Navy sent every ship it had to stop her. On May 24, 1941, in the cold Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, HMS Hood, the pride of the British fleet, met the Bismarck. Hood was a giant warship, 42,000 tons, with 15-inch guns, known all over the world. The fight lasted only 15 minutes. Then Bismarck's 5th shell hit Hood. It went through her thin deck armor and exploded in the rear magazine, setting off 112 tons of cordite. The ship broke in half and sank in under 3 minutes. There were 1,418 men on board. Only 3 lived: signalman Ted Briggs, seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas. The loss shocked the Navy and all of Britain. People thought Hood could never be sunk. She was huge and famous. Her picture was on postcards and cigarette packs. She had sailed the world showing off British power. Now she was gone in minutes. The effect on people was terrible. If Hood could be destroyed, nothing seemed safe. And now Bismarck was free in the Atlantic, with enough guns and speed to crush the ships, bringing food, fuel, and weapons to Britain. Those convoys were protected by small destroyers and corvettes that had no hope against a battleship. Bismarck could destroy merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. The sea route to America might be cut off, and hunger could make Britain give up in months. So every British ship was sent to find Bismarck. Battleships came from all directions. Cruisers spread out in long search lines, and destroyers hurried to join. But finding one ship in the huge Atlantic Ocean was almost impossible. Radar was still basic, and airplanes could not search very far. The sea was just too big. Even if they found Bismarck, she was fast and strong and full of big guns. Fighting her head-on would mean losing many ships and sailors. Admiral Tovey needed a way to slow her down, hurt her engines, or break her steering so the other ships could catch up. He needed help from the fleet air arm. He needed the Swordfish.
Terrible heavy clouds, rain, and high waves. The little planes kept going. Just after midnight, they spotted Bismarck speeding through the rough sea. Her anti-aircraft guns were already firing. The Swordfish came in from many sides to split her defenses. They flew through bursts of shells and glowing tracer fire. Lieutenant Percy Gick, flying plane number 5F, dropped his torpedo. It ran straight and hit the side of Bismarck in the middle. The blast was bright enough for all to see, but it struck the thick armor and only caused a small leak. Still, that leak spilled oil across the water and helped British ships follow Bismarck for the next 2 days. Amazingly, all 9 Swordfish made it back safely to HMS Victorious, even after facing that deadly fire. The attack had not stopped Bismarck, but it proved that the Swordfish could reach and hit even the strongest target. For 2 days, the Royal Navy chased Bismarck across the Atlantic. The ship was hurt and leaking oil, but still deadly. On May 26th, a Catalina flying boat found her again. She was heading toward the French coast, where German planes and defenses could protect her. If she reached the port of Brest, she would be safe. Admiral Tovey's big ships were too far away to stop her. Only one carrier was close enough, HMS Ark Royal. The crew raced to get in range, but the weather was turning into a terrible storm. Launching planes in such high winds was almost impossible. Landing them would be worse. But there was no other choice. This was the last chance to stop Bismarck. At 2:50 in the afternoon, 15 Swordfish from squadrons 810, 818, and 820 took off from Ark Royal. The deck was moving up and down 40 feet in the waves. Several planes nearly crashed as they lifted off. They grouped together and headed out, but radar reports were mixed up and they accidentally attacked the British cruiser HMS Sheffield instead. Luckily, the torpedoes had bad magnetic fuses that exploded early in the rough water, so Sheffield was not hit. The Swordfish returned, embarrassed, but also lucky because they learned those fuses did not work. The crews replaced them with simple contact fuses that went off only when they hit a ship. At 7:10 that evening, 15 Swordfish took off again. The storm was even worse. Winds blew almost 60 miles an hour. Rain made it almost impossible to see. Some pilots could not even see their own wingtips. Waves rose 40 feet higher than the planes were flying. Water poured into the open cockpits, soaking everything and making the compasses hard to read. No one was supposed to fly in weather that bad, but they went anyway. Control could be lost at any time. The planes could break apart in the air. A crash into the dark ocean was very possible. But this was not a normal flight. The future of the war could depend on the next 2 hours. If Bismarck got away, the results would be terrible. The Swordfish pushed through the storm, each pilot fighting the wind and rain alone. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat was one of them. He later said he could barely keep control. The shaking was so bad he thought the wings might rip off. Every gust nearly flipped the plane. Water poured into the open cockpit, soaking him until he was freezing. His hands were numb on the controls, even inside thick gloves. Behind him, his observer and gunner were just as wet and cold and scared. They could see only a few yards ahead. The planes were scattered in the storm, each man flying alone, trying to find the target. Some wondered if they would find Bismarck at all. Others just hoped to live through the weather. The wings bent and shuddered. The steel frame groaned, but the Swordfish stayed together. The old design that looked outdated was saving their lives. Around 8:05, they finally spotted Bismarck, her huge shape showing against the dark clouds, her guns already firing. The Swordfish attacked from different sides. Their slow speed that once seemed useless now worked in their favor. Bismarck's gunners were trained to hit fast planes. The slow biplanes confused their aim. Shells burst all around, but the rough wind and rain made it hard for the Germans to aim right. The Swordfish pilots kept coming closer and closer, some within 1,000 yards or less. They dropped their torpedoes and turned hard through the rain and explosions. At least 2 torpedoes hit. One struck the middle of the ship, doing little harm. The armor stopped the flooding, but the second torpedo hit near the back by the rudder, and that was the hit that changed everything. The blast stuck Bismarck's rudder at about 12 degrees to the left. The huge metal blade that steered the 50,000-ton ship was now jammed solid. The steering room filled with water fast. Damage control teams ran to help, but when they got there, they found the whole area flooded and the gears smashed. The rudder would not move. Captain Ernst Lindman tried to save control. He ordered the crew to steer by using the ship's 3 engines, changing power on each side to turn the ship. This trick only worked when going slow, not at full sea speed. Soon Bismarck was going in wide circles, unable to hold a straight course. Divers tried to go down and look at the rudder, but the waves were too big. They could not reach it. Engineers tried every fix they could think of. They even tried to pull the rudder by hand from inside, but nothing worked. The damage was too bad. Without steering, Bismarck could not reach France or even fight properly. She could only go 10 to 12 knots and turn slowly while the British ships closed in. Admiral Gunther Lurtens, the fleet commander, sent a message to Berlin saying the ship could not steer. He knew that meant the end. The British battleships would soon catch them. Who fired the torpedo that jammed the rudder has been argued for years. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat is usually named because his plane attacked from the left side in the first group. But when James Cameron's dive team explored the wreck in 2002, they found the hole on the right side of the ship. Only 2 pilots had attacked from that direction, Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Pattison and Sub-Lieutenant Douglas Godfrey Fawcett. The truth may never be known. Several torpedoes hit, and any one of them could have been the fatal one. What mattered was that the Swordfish crews together finished their job. Moffat himself never said he was the one when they all gave their first reports. The story that Moffat fired the torpedo came later. All 15 Swordfish came back safely to HMS Victorious. Even in terrible storm and heavy enemy fire, landing on the moving carrier in the dark was as dangerous as the attack itself. But every plane returned. Every crew survived. The next morning, May 27th, the British battleships caught up with Bismarck. HMS King George V and Rodney fired huge shells at the crippled ship. Bismarck tried to fight back but could not steer. After 2 hours of pounding, the ship was a burning wreck. At 10:39, it sank. Over 2,000 men died. Only 115 survived. The pride of the German Navy was gone. The threat to Atlantic convoys was over. And the weapon that made it possible was the old-looking swordfish. The swordfish kept serving all through the war in new roles. In the Mediterranean, swordfish squadrons based in Malta and on carriers became the main weapon against Axis supply lines to North Africa. They flew night attacks on convoys carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles, often in bad weather and against heavily armed escorts. The crews learned to find convoys at night using radar and then attack with torpedoes or bombs. The results were impressive. Squadron 830 from Malta sank about 110,000 tons of Axis shipping between May and November 1941. That meant dozens of merchant ships never reached North Africa. Other Malta squadrons did the same. Conservative estimates say between 300,000 and 450,000 tons of enemy shipping were destroyed by swordfish attacks in the Mediterranean. Each ship sunk meant fewer supplies for Rommel. His attack stalled partly because fuel and ammunition did not arrive. In the Atlantic, the swordfish's role changed again when escort carriers started operating. These were small carriers converted from merchant ships that could travel with convoys and give air cover for the whole journey. Escort carriers usually carried one squadron of swordfish for fighting submarines and enemy ships. The swordfish were very good at this job. With ASV-2 radar, they could find submarines on the surface at night or in bad weather. U-boats liked to travel on the surface at night because they were faster and harder to see. Swordfish with radar could spot them. Once found, the U-boats were attacked with depth charges or torpedoes. Between 1940 and 1945, Swordfish sank or helped sink about 14 to 22 U-boats. The exact number depends on shared kills because some U-boats were attacked by more than one plane or ship, or were damaged by Swordfish but finished off by others. Some attacks were historic firsts. U-64 was sunk on April 13, 1940 by Swordfish from HMS Ark Royal. This was the first U-boat sunk by the Fleet Air Arm. Captain Richard Partridge from the Royal Marines flew the plane, caught the submarine on the surface in Norwegian waters, and sank it with bombs. U-75 was sunk on May 23rd. The German battlecruiser Scharnhorst and Gunnersau and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen attempted to dash up the English Channel from Brest to Germany. The ships had been trapped in Brest for months, subject to constant Royal Air Force bombing. Hitler wanted them moved to Norway, where they could threaten Arctic convoys to Russia. The Channel Dash, Operation Cerberus to the Germans, was a bold move. The narrowest part of the channel was only 21 miles wide. The German ships would have to steam through waters dominated by British naval and air forces. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was to remain in Brest under constant attack. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were determined to stop the dash. If the German ships could be sunk in the channel, it would be a major victory. Plans were made for coordinated attacks by destroyers, motor torpedo boats, bombers, and torpedo bombers. 6 Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron were assigned to the torpedo attack. The squadron was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmonde, the same officer who had led the strike on Bismarck from Victorious 9 months earlier. Esmonde had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for that action. King George VI personally presented the decoration on February 11th, the day before the Channel Dash. The timing was cruelly ironic. Esmonde received his medal for bravery 1 day before facing an even more desperate mission. Esmonde knew the mission was nearly suicidal. The intelligence briefing made that clear. The German ships would be protected by approximately 30 escort vessels, including destroyers and torpedo boats. Over 250 Luftwaffe fighters would provide air cover. The Swordfish would be attacking in daylight, not the darkness that had protected them at Taranto and against Bismarck. They would have minimal fighter escort due to coordination failures and the short range of available Spitfires. Their chances of survival were negligible. Their chances of success were worse. Esmonde assembled his crews and briefed them honestly. The mission was vital. The risks were extreme. Any man could refuse without dishonor or consequence. Every man volunteered. Not one hesitated. They knew exactly what they were being asked to do. They understood the danger, yet they did it anyway. At 12:20 p.m., the 6 Swordfish took off from RAF Manston in Kent. They flew just above the waves, keeping very low to avoid detection, heading straight toward the German ships. British Spitfire fighters were supposed to escort them, but coordination failed, leaving the Swordfish completely alone against the full German force. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dived on them. The slow, old-fashioned biplanes had no chance against the fast, modern fighters. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships rained down on them. Despite the impossible odds, the Swordfish pressed their attack. Within 20 minutes, all 6 aircraft were shot down. 13 of the 18 crew members were killed. Eugene Esmonde's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and set on fire by the fighters. It crashed into the channel around 12:40 p.m. Esmonde died along with his observer, Sub-Lieutenant William Clinton, and his air gunner, leading airman Donald Bunce. 5 crew survived. Pulled from the freezing waters, Sub-Lieutenants Edgar Lee, Brian Rose, Charles Kingsmill, and William Samples, and leading airman Bunce, who had somehow survived the crash. None of the torpedoes hit the German ships. The Channel Dash succeeded, but the sacrifice was remembered. Eugene Esmonde was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, announced on March 3, 1942. The 4 surviving officers each received the Distinguished Service Order. Leading Airman Bunce received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. The 13 who died were mentioned posthumously in dispatches. Even German Admiral Otto Kylax, commanding the Dash, recognized the attack as an act of supreme courage. The Royal Navy called it one of the finest examples of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty the war had ever seen. The 825 Naval Air Squadron had struck at Taranto, attacked Bismarck, and sacrificed themselves in the Channel Dash. Their courage became legendary. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Swordfish had served 9 years. Production had stopped in August 1944 after 2,391 aircraft were built. The type had outlived multiple aircraft designed to replace it. The Fairey Albacore, meant to succeed the Swordfish, entered service in 1940 but was withdrawn in 1943. The Albacore was faster and had an enclosed cockpit, but it could not match the reliability and versatility of the Swordfish. The Swordfish kept flying frontline missions all the way until VE Day in May 1945. Very few military planes last that long and still stay effective. Everyone who flew it or worked on it loved it. Pilots liked how it handled, how reliable it was, and how forgiving it was of mistakes. Mechanics liked that it was simple and easy to fix. Crews trusted it completely. Its nickname, the Stringbag, was used with real affection. The plane looked old and awkward. It was slow and uncomfortable, but it always worked. No matter the weather or the mission, the Swordfish could be counted on to get the job done and bring the crew home. That trust made people loyal to it in a way that newer, faster planes never achieved. Even 80 decades later, after the Swordfish crippled Bismarck, its place in history is clear. By every technical measure, the Swordfish was outdated before the war started. Its top speed was 143 miles per hour, while other fighters flew over 300 miles per hour. Its cockpit was open, while most planes had enclosed cockpits. It had fixed landing gear, while retractable gear was normal. Its body was fabric when metal was standard. It was a biplane, while most planes were monoplanes. Yet this old plane achieved victories that changed the course of the war. At Taranto, the Swordfish crippled the Italian battle fleet and changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Against Bismarck, the Swordfish delivered the attack that doomed Germany's most powerful battleship. During the war, Swordfish protected convoys, sank U-boats, attacked shipping, and did every mission asked of them. The key was never really the plane itself. The key was the people who flew it. The Swordfish was just fabric, wire, and steel tubing, but the pilots, observers, and gunners were extraordinary. They were highly trained. The Fleet Air Arm made sure crews met strict standards. Pilots mastered flying by instruments, navigation, torpedo attacks, and landing on carriers. Observers became expert at navigation and bombing. Air gunners learned to fight off enemy planes while handling radios. The training was intense, complete, and never-ending. The crews were deeply motivated. They knew the stakes. Britain was often alone in the war. Every mission mattered. Every attack counted. Failure meant defeat. Success meant survival. The motivation was life or death. The tactics were clever. Instead of complaining about the Swordfish's weaknesses, the Fleet Air Arm used its strengths. They attacked at night when speed was less important. They flew low to stay below radar. They struck from multiple directions to overwhelm defenses. They used the slow speed to confuse anti-aircraft guns, turning weaknesses into advantages. The crews were absolutely determined. They flew through heavy fire that should have been deadly. They flew in weather that grounded other planes. They kept formation when it seemed impossible. They completed missions when survival seemed unlikely. That determination made the difference between failure and success. Skilled people using average tools will beat average people using the best tools. This idea works beyond the military. In any area, human factors matter more than technology. Training, motivation, creativity, and determination beat specifications. The Germans had Bismarck, the most powerful battleship. They had superior technology, but not superior people at the crucial moment. The Swordfish crews flew old planes, but had the skill and courage to do the impossible. In 1941, Britain could not match German technology everywhere. British tanks were worse, British fighters were about equal, British bombers had less range. But Britain could train excellent crews and develop smart tactics. The Swordfish program shows this perfectly. Use the planes you have, train crews to excel, make tactics that work, apply them with determination, accept the risks, complete the mission. It worked. When the war ended, the men who flew Swordfish went back to civilian life with memories of amazing experiences. They had flown old planes into almost impossible situations and succeeded. They had faced death many times and survived. They had done things that would seem made up if not fully documented. Their legacy goes beyond combat victories. The Swordfish crews showed that being behind in technology doesn't mean you lose. They proved that well-trained, motivated people can beat better equipment. They showed that courage and skill matter more than specs. These lessons still matter 80 years later. In a world obsessed with high-tech, the Swordfish story reminds us that people make the difference. Organizations spend a lot on equipment, but sometimes ignore training, maintenance, and morale. The Swordfish experience shows that is the wrong approach. Invest in people.